All right, hey folks, how's it going? Happy Monday. Hope you had a nice weekend. Just to recontextualize where we're at, we've been hanging out for a while. It's been a couple months learning JavaScript. I hope you all have had fun with it. We're reaching the tail end, at least my initial time with you all. I'll be back later on, but we're transitioning over to React. So today's lesson, we'll be talking about form validation with JavaScript, talking a bit more about that. Tomorrow we'll do the project, and Neil will transition into React with David, who will talk to you about what that is, sort of an upgraded version of what we've been doing so far. It's probably the lightest way to touch on it. With that said, from this module, Interactive Web Pages with JavaScript, real quick, just to warm our brains up, what are some things that we talked about last time or the time before? What are some things that you all remember from the last couple of lessons that we talked about? Any keywords that pop out, any concepts that you can recall? I'm sure at this point it just feels like we've been filling up your brains with all kinds of things. So what have we been talking about recently? Roger says his brain's completely empty. Perfect. We'll fill it up today. Got plenty of room. That's great. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, we talked about event handling last time, right? So that was, we were triggering certain events to fire some JavaScript code according to when they happen, things like on click. It could be on key press, all kinds of different events. Perfect. What else? Yeah, so addEventListener was the method we used to add those events. addEventListener was a higher order function, right? Because it accepted first a type of event, and the second thing was a function, right? So it accepted a function as an argument, which would fire when that event happened. Excellent. Anything else we discussed that you all can recall? Excellent, Joseph. Thanks for that. Yeah, prevent default, right? So first we learned about the event object. So the event object is something that we get access to by or when we pass in that higher order function. That function gets passed as an argument to addEventListener. Within that event object, there are a number of key value pairs, a number of properties, things like target, current target, certain locations, as well as prevent default, a method that you can call to prevent the default behavior of whatever it is that's currently happening. Perfect. Particularly important for forms, for sure. All right, nice job, y'all. Yeah, so that was a lot of what we talked about last time, right? And so again, we've moved from doing pure JavaScript, running code in the terminal, to interacting with JavaScript with our HTML and CSS. We first talked about DOM manipulations. That was accessing elements in the DOM, manipulating them, for example, changing their style. We could change their text. We could remove them from the page. We could update them. We could create new DOM elements and add them to the page, right? With a lot of options. And then with that, as opposed to doing something silly like building a web page with pure DOM manipulation, which is interesting, but not something you normally do, we can now do some of that stuff based on events that actually get triggered by user interaction. Maybe this feels like, yeah, no duh, we want to do stuff like this. But this is actually quite this is a big deal when this came out long ago, because for a long time, websites essentially were just posters that maybe had some neat visuals on them, but were not very interactable. And so JavaScript is allowing us to account for and interact with users so that we can do all kinds of visual and more informational things, as we'll see. So today's lesson is about form validation. So it's about a specific type of user interaction with forms. There's a lot that could be written about form validation. There's all kinds of different best practices, all kinds of different ways to do it. Today, we're going to be working with a particular type of object called the validity object, focusing on it that way. But if you'll look at form validation, you'll find lots of different ways to do form validation. And for better or worse, forms is one of the main ways that we interact with web pages. You all can imagine signing up for a website, or I don't know, even filling out a profile, right? Entering a new post on social media, that is a form. So forms are really quite ubiquitous in terms of how they interact with people on the web. So that is the plan for today. Right, I'm going to take over screen sharing here. Excellent, excellent. All right, so here is our lesson for today. So overview: in this lesson, you're going to learn about form validation using JavaScript, and understand how to validate user input to ensure the data collected is accurate and conforms to expected formats. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to implement client-side form validation, use JavaScript to check the correctness and completeness of user input, and provide some user feedback based on validation results. So that is the plan. This lesson, I don't think, is actually too long. We're going to review some validation that you all have probably already talked about, but long ago, it'll feel like. And then we'll get into JavaScript form validation. And then we have this lab that I think will take a bit of time. So we'll try and give you all a good amount of time for that lab, so you can really just get some practice in with this, as well as all of the other skills we've talked about. So that is the plan for today. But first, discussion question. Imagine you are signing up for a new social media platform and you accidentally mistype your email address or choose a password that doesn't meet the security requirements. What do you all think for some of these questions? How do you think the website should handle these mistakes? Why do you think it's important for websites to check for errors and forms before sending the information to the server? And can you think of any other good examples where form validation is crucial for a good user experience? Let's start with this first question here. How do you think the website should handle these mistakes? A mistake like you type in an email wrong, or you choose a password that doesn't meet their criteria. How do you think the website should handle mistakes like this? Yeah, thanks, Travis. So Travis shares, it will display an error that the email format is not correct, or that some rule in regards to the password was not met. Perfect. Thanks. I feel like one of the things that's really helpful there that I think you're identifying is it doesn't just say, nope, right? Or it says like, you did something wrong. Trying to give actually clear messages as to what is wrong is really useful as users. All right, so I think these are a couple comments on checking if it's in a valid format. Yeah, so it should check for that. What kind of feedback to the user do we expect to get? I think that's part of the question here as well. What kind of feedback to the user? So displaying errors, right? Giving some information on what went wrong, not just that something went wrong. Sure, yeah. Share if someone's logging in, right? Share a message that's, please enter the correct password. Yeah, so Omar points out preventative could be helpful as well. So if we're trying to limit the length of a password, actually just don't let them do that, right? Just add constraints that we can't do the wrong thing. That's probably the best case scenario. All right, excellent. People are sharing different things. Um, just sort of an opposite to this question. Have you all had any experiences on websites where the form validation has not been helpful? I'll give an example here. I find it pretty annoying when I'm trying to type my email and I immediately get a message that's like, your email is wrong. It's like, I've typed 2 characters. Give me a moment, right? Are there any errors that you all have gotten that have been unhelpful or misleading in any way that you can think of? We got several people are typing. People got bones to pick some of these forms. No. I was saying, I'm trying to put in date of birth. For some reason, month and day did not work. Yeah, for sure. That sounds obnoxious. I wonder if it's an order thing or something like that. But yeah, and anytime as well when there's no feedback, right? That's not helpful. I've had forms before where I hit submit and the form clears, but it says, ah, something was wrong. I find that pretty annoying, right? There's lots of ways we can sort of do this where it puts pressure on the user to sort of decide, do I want to continue or not? And that's kind of what we want to avoid when we're developing a front end. All right, let's talk about the second question. Why is it important for websites to check for errors in forms for sending the information to the server? We haven't talked too much about servers as of yet. This would be basically before storing that data, before sending it back to be saved as part of your profile. Why do you all think it's important to check for errors? Yeah, so Travis points out this could lead to an account not being created, for sure. I also think it might be important to check for errors for sending the information. Right, it's a mystery. So I'll add for why it's important for websites to check for errors. Any validation we can do on the front end, which is that's where we're working, that saves us a request going to the back end. And that's where our server is. So essentially, the more validation we can do up front, the less validation we have to do later on. So that's perhaps one reason why we want to do some validation on the front part, on the front end of our websites. Yeah, and then Joseph gets another one, which is ensures the user enters their data in a form that wherever this information is getting stored will understand. So for example, if a form is asking you to input your age and you type in a string, that might cause an error in the back. It might cause an error later when that data is called up. So you're trying to sort of protect wherever your data source is from poorly formatted or incorrect information. And yeah, I'd be surprised at how many problems can get caused by just the slightest bit of incorrect data. All right, I'm still typing. For some reason, I feel like it's gonna be something sassy. I'm just expecting it. No, not too much. All right, he's rethinking it. All right, cool. So again, the reason we want to do this, we want to focus on making sure the user's experience is a good one for entering forms. Often this is their first interaction with our web applications, from stuff like signing up, logging in, things like that. So we want it to be a good one, right? And then of course we want to overall protect our data on really all sides of the application. All right, so now we're going to go back through some of the form validation stuff that you all probably talked about when we were first learning HTML forms. Let me actually just ask as like a gut check here. How familiar, how much do you all remember about form validation from HTML forms? As like thumbs down being like, I don't remember anything. Thumbs up being like, yeah, feeling great about this. Feel free to add another emoji somewhere if there's a different feeling. Does this feel like, oh yeah, I remember some of these keywords and things, or does this feel pretty distant from y'all? Y'all think when I say form validation in terms of HTML, does this feel like, oh yeah, I remember this? Omar says required. Yeah, it is required to do this work. Oh, but you probably mean the property required, in which case, yeah, that's definitely one of them. All right, based on the lack of response, I'm gonna assume this is a bit tepid. All right, so we will go ahead and go through this. This is a chance for us to review some content. Let me know if you want me to slow down or go over anything in more detail. This is meant to be a review, but if there's something that maybe wasn't covered or you feel like you didn't talk about too much, please do let me know. All right, so form validation reintroduction. So client-side form validation, or more commonly referred to as form validation in a general sense. First, the process of checking the data entered into a form directly within the user's device or browser interface. This validation occurs in real time as the user fills out the form, providing instant feedback on whether the data meets the specified criteria, such as a particular format or a particular length, right? It helps improve user experience by preventing the submission of incorrect or incomplete data before it is sent off to your server for further processing, as we discussed. So when we learned about HTML, we touched on form validation briefly. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about dynamic and customizable form validation with JavaScript by way of event listeners. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and refamiliarize ourselves with the built-in HTML form validation. And as it says here, it's important to understand the right time to use the right tool. And sometimes only HTML is enough. The built-in HTML validators are pretty good. They are honestly quite good at the end of the day. All right, so real quick, I'll pop quiz here. Which of the following is not a good reason for form validation? What do you all think? Give you all a second, plug in an answer. Yeah, indeed. Right. So this one just sounds a bit strange and out of pocket anyway, right? So increasing server load, nothing there is necessarily here that relates to form validation. These other ones, though, do relate. So enhancing user experience for sure, giving some kind of feedback, as we discussed, can be helpful for users to make sure they enter information in the right way. Enhancing data integrity, making sure that that data that goes to our backend, to wherever it's getting stored, that is in the right format is pretty important. And preventing security vulnerabilities. This can be true too, in terms of making sure that the right kind of information is going through and that we're not validating someone to enter a website maybe who shouldn't be validated, something like that. All right, so you all may have talked about some of these, if not all of them, in terms of HTML validation, some of the most common types of HTML validation. So require, min length and max length, min and max, type, and pattern. So let's go over these quite quickly. All right, so in this first example, we'll talk about required. So when required is added as an attribute to an HTML element, it will make sure that there is some value within that input field. So in this example, here's the form we're looking at. We have a label for our favorite K-drama. We got an input type, it's just text, an ID of K-drama, and it has the attribute required, and then a submit button in here. So if we just hit submit, it'll say, please fill out this field. That's our HTML validation. As soon as we type anything in here, it's A-OK. Right, so required is just checking that there is a value within the form field, not that a specific value, just a form value, and it'll stop a form from being submitted in the event that there are empty values that need to get filled in. Oh, this one's not too bad, right? It's a pretty easy one. All right, so for min length and max length, these are used when we want to control the length of data, which is string, in a text input. So in this example, we have enter username that is at least 8 characters, but no longer than 20 characters. Let's say I want to put in a username like this. This is too short, right? So maybe I would have to keep adding some text until it gets to that minimum. I think that's pretty much it. Oh yeah, so no here, when the site loads, the built-in validation will not consider the input invalid until the user starts typing. So right here, it looks like, we can see this is like kind of highlighted green, maybe a little bit hard to see on my screen. On your screen, it should be a bit clearer. But as soon as you start typing, that's where the validation gets triggered. It's just an important note there of how that works. All right, so min length and max length deal with strings and text. min and max are used to control number inputs. So this is helpful for all kinds of different, essentially like e-commerce sites, but there's all kinds of different fields where you might want to know, be able to check specific values that are numerical. So in this form example, we have the type is number, and then we have the min is 0, and the max is 9. So if I type in here 876, right, these are valid. If I try to put a number larger than 9, you'll see that it highlights to red. So min and max are related to numerical values, whereas min length and max length are related to textual values. All right, and then we've seen this a few times, but just defining a type on your inputs is a good way to make sure that a certain type of thing comes in. So for example, with input type date, that's ensuring that we get a date picker with which to pick the correct date. With input type file, that's making sure that we have an option to pick a file, right, of some type. And notice some of this is blurred out, or is grayed out, I should say, because it's not of the correct type here. Within the input, there's also an accept attribute where you can define the file types that are allowed. And then you can also do something like password. It doesn't change actually what is accepted, but it'll change how it looks, right? So this is a password type field will hide the characters getting entered in. And in this case, there's also min length and max length, which have been messed with right here. Cool. And that is our type. All right. The last one we're going to talk about today is the pattern attribute, or get reminded of today's pattern attribute. Did you all talk about regexes earlier? Is this a new thing? Sorry, I didn't see that look, Omar. Regex is new, or is this a rabbit hole we've already descended down? Okay, excellent. Honestly, glad he didn't. This is the kind of thing that you can spend way too much time on, which is kind of cool, but gets really wild. So I'll briefly talk about this. I'm going to implore you to maybe look this up on your own time, but to not spend more than 25 minutes researching it, because for some reason I feel like folks new to coding are like, wow, regex are so cool. And then 10 hours have gone by and you're bleary-eyed waking up at 4 in the morning or something like that and thinking about regexes. So excellent. Thanks for the promise, Ravish. So regexes are a way, or called regular expressions, I should say, and that's what it refers to. It's sort of like a, I don't know, encoded way of ensuring that text matches a certain format, and it has its own kind of secret code that it feels like to it. It can be really useful for things like validating an email, validating a password in terms of it has certain kinds of characters or has certain length and has certain characters, like a bunch of different constraints they want to put on something. It ends up looking something like this. The pattern attribute is a way to enforce that the text put into whatever the input field is or text field fits a certain format. It meets some kind of criteria. So this is the pattern we're looking at here. This looks like nonsense, and it basically is nonsense, but there's some logic here. But what this is trying to constrain us to do is to say, create a username that's between 3 and 20 characters, letters, numbers, and underscores only. What this is saying right here, this little top caret is saying, I believe we're at the start of the string. This $sign means at the very end. These brackets are saying here are the allowed characters. So that's A through Z capital letters, 0 through 9, and underscores. And then it's saying it can be between 3 and 20 characters. Again, this is the kind of thing that, in my experience, I'll be trying to think, okay, I need this kind of pattern to fit. Well, let me go ahead and look this up. Let me play around with regexes and kind of figure this out. This is not the kind of thing that I would commit to memory. There's so many other things you could be storing in there. other coding techniques, React, a recipe you like. Many things could be more valuable to be stored in your brain than regex is, in my personal opinion here. But they can be quite powerful. And actually, we can see that here with password, where this pattern, which looks inscrutable, and I would say is pretty inscrutable, is going to check to make sure that the password is at least 8 characters, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, and 1 number is involved. So they can be really neat. They can be like really powerful, and are generally applicable to situations like this where there's an input that's coming in and we want some specific way to validate that without writing a lot of code. So there is definitely a use case for them. They're just very particular, I think, in how they work. And this kind of thing I think you pick up over time playing around with it as opposed to studying it deeply. But again, we won't spend too much time here. Either way, you can use the pattern attribute. This is what we're talking about here, right? This is a validation that can be provided for HTML. So if I just try and log in here, actually, let's type in something. Right now it's just saying, please match the requested format, because right now this is not 3 or 20 characters. So that part's good. If I enter in this, I'm going to enter in just password. Right now, this example, it's not a password field, just so we can see what it is. If I hit enter here, we can see it is going to throw an error for this. One thing to note is that this validation, one of the, I would say, downsides to using a regex like this is it's not actually going to tell us what's wrong. It won't tell the user, oh, hey, you're forgetting a number as well, right? It's not explaining what's happening. It's just saying you gotta read the instructions here and do this correctly, right? So that's a little bit different. If you wanted to give more feedback, I don't know if a regex would be the most useful thing to use. All right, but that is another type of pattern here. And again, there's a number of different inputs that can accept this, which I think is pretty useful. A couple that are really useful here is like email, URL, password. Those I think show up a lot in terms of wanting to verify that something's in a very particular format. All right, we are at this knowledge check. So which HTML attribute is used to specify the minimum length of input in a text field? What do y'all think? Minimum length of input in a text field. Yeah, all right, we got some folks weighing in here. Yeah, correct answer here is B, right? So remember, min length is related to text information. All right, so that was a bit quick, but I hope most of this was review, perhaps besides pattern. Any questions on these before we move forward in terms of how these work, when we would use them, what they're for? Okay-ish. So this is coming back. Some of this is resurfacing from long ago, like dredging up through a swamp of like, oh yeah, okay, all right, required. That's right, okay. And there's a type of different form fields, right? There we go. Thumbs up from Tina. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. So as you all saw, these are quite powerful in a lot of ways. They're pretty easy to add as well. I would say they're named nicely in general. Min and min length feels a little like, I don't know, or kind of pushing the boundaries here of clarity, but fair enough. They at least have some different meanings. So there's something very useful there about HTML forms validation. There was some limitations. So one, we saw we couldn't really do anything too custom with this without using pattern, which is a little complex, as we saw with regular expressions, and perhaps doesn't allow a ton of customization. We also saw that the messages at times can perhaps be a bit vague, because we definitely saw that with pattern. And other times we might just want to provide a different kind of message in terms of what it is we want to show up. The other thing with HTML validation, and we weren't really seeing this as part of what we were looking at here, but HTML validation on its own is not affecting the style in any way. It's actually just the thing that's showing up at this text right here, right? This is the thing. that is actually showing it because of HTML validation. So we want to highlight more what is wrong with the form. We'll want to use JavaScript to do that. So we can do that with what's called custom form validation. So this is using JavaScript to somewhat, as soon as you'll hear this term like hijack, it'll like jump into the HTML form validation and provide some customization within it. In this case, we're actually going to still use the HTML validators, but we're also going to use JavaScript in order to influence maybe, what color something changes, what message shows up, and add some customizability to our form validations. All right, so the official name of this is the constraint validation API. So within JavaScript, we're given a handful of methods and properties where we can check if our form inputs are valid or invalid. Based on the state of these inputs, we can then perform whatever logic we deem necessary, such as changing colors, such as showing a message. And now that we've reviewed those built-in validations, we'll be able to see how we can leverage those with JavaScript. So the thing we're going to look at is the validity property. This property returns an object that contains a large number of properties, which handle a variety of different validations. There's also a few methods attached to them as well. So here are the ones we'll be looking at. So this property, we're going to see this is attached to individual input elements that we can access from the DOM. And all of these properties are going to give us information on the state of the input. So we have properties of valid, which is going to return a Boolean based on the form validity. We'll be able to check for value missing, which will return a Boolean based on whether required input has a value or not. Type mismatch returns a Boolean based on whether value matches input syntax. Too short or too long, which returns Boolean based on whether the text is too short, too long, et cetera, et cetera. Anything you'll notice about the descriptions here? Any common patterns you see? I don't think any patterns you see in this. Yeah. Oh, Joseph, everyone's got it, right? These are all returning Booleans. So we're going to be getting back some Boolean value, or true or false. And then we'll be able to, if the value is true, if the value is false, perform some kind of operation. So that is the plan. All right, so let's take a look at this first one. I'm going to go pretty slow, I think, through these because I think it's kind of easy to get confused as to what exactly is going on. And there's a couple that we'll need to make some changes to as well. So let's first take a look at this HTML. All right, so we have some style that's been added to the header here. Sure. We have our body, we have an H1, and then we have a form here. At the very bottom, we have our script, which is attaching our JavaScript file. So within the form, we just have a one input field with a label, and that's our email. It has a type of email, ID of email, and then we have a status H2, which is going to show what the status is. So the first thing we're checking is whether or not something is valid. So just to demo here, what's going to happen if I type over here, right? This is currently not a valid email address. For some reason, this is, I think, just a quirk of how JavaScript works. If we just have the @email, that seems to work just fine. If we add the subdomain, we'll need to complete the subdomain before it is complete. But just entering in like some name will show up as invalid. Okay, so how does this work? So in the JavaScript file, we have const email. We're grabbing the email input, right, with get element by ID, and we're grabbing the status span with validity span. Remember, that is this input, and that's this span over here with these specific IDs. Right now we have an event listener added to our email input. This event is on input. So what that means is every time we type something within it, this function is going to fire. let me ask you all a question about this. In this case, what does the E represent here? This just says E. What is that representing as part of this passed in function, this callback function? What does the E represent? I think I mentioned this briefly last week. And or you can just identify sort of what we're looking at here. Let me think. What does the E represent? All right, so in this case, right, the E represents the event. Remember that the function we pass in to our event listener, this is called a callback function, right? That callback function gets used by addEventListener whenever there's an input event that gets fired. And when that function is called, in this case, it's an anonymous function, when that anonymous function is called, it passes in the event. This event was the thing that we looked at last week where we printed out all the key value pairs and saw there were dozens of different key value pairs, right, that had all kinds of different values. There's methods and properties and HTML objects, all kinds of different things in there. So this event is within here, and sometimes you'll see this abbreviated to just E. Okay, so that's what we're looking at there. Within this callback function, we have a conditional statement. We are saying if the email, all right, so this is the actual element itself, within the validity object attached to the email, if the valid property is true, go ahead and change some of the attributes of that status span of this text right here. If this value returns false, go ahead and set it to invalid and red, right? So they start typing some letters in here. So this validity object is attached to the actual input. And so we can actually look at this entire object by just printing it out whenever we type. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, I'm going to refresh this page here. As soon as I type one thing, you can see this gets printed out, gets logged out to our terminal. But see, it looks like an object is a special type of object called validity state. If I expand this, we can see there are a number of different key value pairs in here. All right, there are a number of different key value pairs in here. One of them is valid. It's checking whether or not this is valid. And so this is what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the lesson here, pretty much. It's just this object that has a bunch of information in here. Based on this object, we can then write some code that'll react to that. This object gets generated, or I should say, the values within this object get generated based on what we attach to the input. So the fact that this has an input type of email, right now, that is causing this type mismatch to be true, I believe, as well as this valid to be false, because right now this is not a valid email. So this is doing some of the work that regular expression was forcing us to do. Let me pause here. Any questions about how this object is getting generated right now? It's a little tricky because we have the HTML is affecting this JavaScript object that we get access to, like accessing the input via the DOM. So there's a little bit of like a trail going here to get all this information in. Right. So I'm going to go ahead and then put in a correct email. You'll see each time I put input, this is printing out. By the time I put in a correct input, a correct email, we see that valid here becomes true. And in this case, type mismatch becomes false. Yeah, great question, Joseph. So Joseph asks if the validity object can be used for other things like password or only with email. So what validity is attached to is any input element at all. And we'll have a few different examples of how this works. So validity shows up when you have an input, something form fillable. All right, so that's where the validity object will come from. This specific property of valid is dependent on what attributes are attached to this input. So validity will come with any type of input, including things like something that's like a password or email, or like a radio button or numerical fields, all that kind of stuff. All right, excellent. Cool. So this first one, again, we're just checking just for valid from the validity object. Let's take a look at the next one here. So in this next one, we're going to be checking for value missing. So let's take a look again at the files we have here. So we have our HTML file. You'll see there's a bit more style in here. And then we have a few different input fields. So we have name, we have email, and we have favorite food here. For the first two up here, notice we have the HTML attribute required. All right, that's attached to our inputs. So our inputs for the name and email, those are required. But this favorite food is not. This is technically optional. All right, so let's take a look at what we're doing with missing value. It looks like a lot, but it's not actually, it's not that bad. We can definitely do it. All right, so first of all, we're just selecting a whole bunch of the different elements from the page. As soon as the page loads, we're going to check name and email validity. It seems like this was spelled a little bit wrong. That's okay, as long as it all is consistent. And then check all input validity. This happens as well when someone clicks the submit button. So let's check for let's take a look at these functions and what they are doing. So this one that's checking the name and email validity, it's going to check for both the name and the email whether the value is missing from here. So it's not actually checking for whether or not they're particularly formatted anyway. It's just checking that there's something there. So we can notice that with email, right? This email is not a valid email, but it is present. And at this point, that's all we're checking for. So for check name and email validity, we're saying, again, we're grabbing the .value missing property from that validity object. That object is attached to, in the first case, the name input, and in the second case, the email input. If the value is missing, so if I remove this name, it'll say invalid. Otherwise, they'll go ahead and say valid just for being present, right? This check all input validity. Here, we're going through each of the inputs, and these inputs are defined up here. We've selected all inputs. This is query selector all, so it's grabbing this, and this. And for each one, it's checking, hey, if value missing is triggered from this object, then go ahead and say that the form is overall invalid. That's what we're looking at here. Right now, the email supposedly is valid. The name is invalid. Therefore, the overall form is invalid. That's the check that's happening here. We're checking through all inputs. But notice for favorite food, there's nothing in here as well, but that's not triggering any validation problems, right? That's not triggering any validation problems. That's because it's not required. And so I think let's do this. I'm trying to make sure this is like hyper clear. So I'm going to log out name.validity. I'll say name.validity just so you can see what we're looking at. And then let's do the same thing for, I don't have food up here. I'm going to go ahead and just add it. Guessing it's got an ID of food. All right, so all I'm doing is I'm adding two console logs so that when we load the page, we're going to take a look at the validity object of each of these things. So go ahead and refresh that. So in our console, we have two validity states. Okay, so let's take a look at name validity first. So inside of here, we see we have all these different key value pairs. Value missing is true. Value missing is true when this loads. Why is that? Because we have set the name to be required. If we take a look at food validity, value missing is false. And that is because the food input is not required. So it's not even checking as to whether or not there's a value missing, because it doesn't care. There can't be a value missing. The value isn't required. Therefore, we're not going to hold it accountable for having something empty. So just to be clear, when we're filling out this form, right, and submitting it, the overall form validation, that's checking to see if everything in here, or maybe put it a different way, if any of these have a value missing. If so, it'll set it to be invalid. Otherwise, it'll be valid. And because favorite food is not required, it's not checking for value missing, so it can be skipped over. And that is the difference there. Cool, let me pause here. Any questions on this? Feeling good, feeling okay, feeling all right. All right, just trying to get a reaction. All right, excellent. So value missing, again, just one of the key value pairs within that validity object. All right, for type mismatch, this one's going to be a little bit different. Type mismatch is a property that isn't as widely used, but still important to know. For example, if you try typing text inside of a number input, by its natural constraints, this would be impossible. However, when you add an email or URL input to your page application, we can utilize this handy property. So in here, if I just type in my website, right, this is not actually a URL. And we take a look over here for your website, the type here is URL. So we need something valid. We would need something like http:// just this, and yeah, there's a couple of there's a bit of weirdness here. So the URL input is a little different. It wants either a full URL or a protocol. We really haven't talked about this too much. I wouldn't stress too much about it just yet. But the catch is if you do a full URL, the HTTPS is required. So if I do something like google.com, this is not going to work. But something like http:// it will indeed trigger that. This is a little bit light on the URL formatting. The email check is thankfully a bit more straightforward, but as you all saw, if you just have at the domain, this will work as well. Yeah, Omar is asking, so if you do something like yada : / this is fine. It seems to pretty much just be checking that this colon shows up somewhere between the overall input. I think that's why at the top up here, this sort of says type mismatch is a property that isn't as widely used. This seems a little bit insufficient to me for a URL. This is probably something where, unfortunately, a regular expression might be a bit better or some other kind of custom JavaScript. But for certain types, this can, I suppose, be a bit useful. We take a look at the actual JavaScript over here. This is pretty much the same as what we've seen before, right? We're checking for a particular key within the validity object, and depending on its value, changing some values inside of here. Cool. That is that one. All right, excellent. For this one, let's talk about what it should be doing. And then I'm going to pass over to you. This would be a bit of an exercise to implement it. So last one we're going to talk about here is too short and too long. These properties will confirm if a text value's length meets the parameters set by the min length and max length attributes. So how this should be working is over here we have two different passwords, right? Or sorry, I should say a password and then a confirm password field. In here, if we type in some short password, we're going to get a message that the password is too short. I think, does this input have? It does not at the moment. Great. Okay. So also if I type in a bunch of stuff, this will tell us it is too long. All right. So that's the idea behind too short and too long, right? It's just going to give us some sort of check, just like the other ones, whether or not it's true or false. In this JavaScript is not using the validity object. It's actually just doing its own little JavaScript check. So let's just talk about how this is working first, and then I would love for us to back up away from this and use the validity object. So this function called check passwords, right? This does a check where it grabs the password, grabs the confirm password fields, right, in the DOM, grabs the error message as well, so it can show some errors. And then it's manually checking the value within the password to say, hey, is the length greater than 30 or is it less than 8? It's assigning the return value of those statements to some new variables and then checking, hey, if it's too long or too short, go ahead and do some stuff to show up an error message, right? That's what it's doing here. But it's not actually using the validity object. So what I want to do is I want to pass it over to you all. Go ahead and figure out how to use the validity object here that will call too long or too short. So let me just point out a couple of other things. So I'm gonna just load the page, or sorry, when we trigger this check passwords function, we're just gonna log out validity here. And I guess one thing is this check passwords function is getting called. If you take a look down here, we have this button and it has an on click where it's calling check passwords. This was, if you remember, I guess it was just the last lesson. We're talking about different ways to add event listeners. This is one of those on event listeners where it's just built inline. So when this button is clicked, it will go ahead and call this function. I'm going to refresh and call this. Let's open up terminal here. So if we take a look at the validity state, there are a few things within the password here. In this case, it's actually saying a valid true, but it has some other values in here as well. But notice we do have a too long and too short property. Right now, these are both false, but this password is too short. Would you all agree with that? It says enter password 8 to 30 characters. This password is too short. So we would expect this to be true at this point. So what I want you all to try out is try updating this JavaScript code so that we are actually using password.validity too short and password.validity too long. In order to get these to trigger, remember we'll need to make changes to the HTML element as well, because the attributes we add to that input, that is what's going to trigger the validity object to change values. Okay, that's the task. Let's go ahead and take 3 or 4 minutes to give that a shot. It's all based on what we talked about. Just try some things out, play around with the code, see what happens. We'll come back and talk about it together. If you get to a good solution, give me a thumbs up or something in chat, all right? I'll put up a timer up here and we will check back in a few minutes. So give it a shot and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you very much. All right, so let's talk again about what is happening here and what the task is. So right now, this is using some custom JavaScript. to show up these errors. That's still good, but I wanted just to see if we could trigger this validity object as well. So what do y'all think? What is the first thing you think we need to do? What's the first thing you all tried to update this code to use validity? What do y'all think? Based on what we've seen with the last few examples, what do y'all think we need to do? This really stump y'all? We moved beyond the Rubicon. And we says the energy level passed out face down on the floor. I understand. Sometimes that's how it goes. All right, well, let's start here. Refresh this. Okay. Yeah, fair, Omar. No worries. All right, perhaps y'all are working on this. Let's come back together and discuss. So right now, I just loaded the form. I just hit create account. Whenever I hit create account, I'm logging out password.validity.toShort. You all tell me, is this password right now too short? Based on the instructions we have up here, is password too short? Yeah, it is. Thanks, Joseph. So in this case, the password's too short, but it says false right here. This says false. We would expect this to be true, right? Because this is, there's nothing in here. That's too short. That's less than 8 characters. All right, so somehow the first thing I think we need to do is figure out how do we trigger this to become true. And now remember, these attributes, these are not magic. They can't understand like what we've typed in textually and figure it out. They need a bit more instruction than that. So in order to trigger this kind of key value pair from coming through, we need to head back over to the HTML and take a look at our password here. Right now, there are no validations on this input. Well, actually, let me put it a different way. There's no validations other than the type, right? And this type even is just saying, hey, hide the text when I type something in. So there's no validations here. So for a text field, what attribute can I add to validate the size, the length of a text field? What's one of the attributes I can add? We discussed earlier as part of one of the knowledge checks. What are one of the attributes I can add here to validate the text? Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, Omar. All right, so we could say min length, and then we can set what the min length is. Agreed, we'll probably have to set up max length. Let's go ahead and just start with just this one right now. All right, now what I want to see is when I add this, does this too short value change anyway? So let's refresh, let's clear this out. All right, so this is still hitting false here. I'm gonna try something just for kicks here. So then I typed in some characters here, and it came out true. So let me just do it one more time. Did it a little fast. So if we refresh the page, I hit create account. The first thing that comes through is that it is indeed, or it says that it's false. Or if I just hit create account, if I type in a couple letters and then hit create account, it comes back as true. So this is the value we're looking for, right? This is the value we're looking for. We're looking for validity.toShort to come back as true because 3 characters is less than 8 characters, right? At least agreed on that point. At least like this is too short. This is coming back true. That's working well. There's still something odd here happening where if it's empty, it's coming back false, right? So we can address that in just one sec. Let's first focus on the too short part of things, which is coming back true. All right, so perfect. When we type in a password, but that password is too short, password.validity.toShort, that comes back as true. Excellent. So what we need to do with this is just take this statement, as opposed to defining our own down here, we can just swap in password.validity.toShort. So now we're using the validity object, right? Now we're using the validity object. For too long, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be the same thing. Over here, we'll set max length as 30. And then we could say password dot validity dot too long. Last thing we would do here is just substitute this variable name with the validity check. Okay, so now if we have a password that is too short, we'll still get this message. There's a couple of edge cases here, so I'll talk about those. But before we move forward, any questions on this? Any questions on this step to use validity? Seems good. Sorry, just give me a thumbs up. Means we're rolling. All right, so not too bad of a switch here, right? So let's talk about some of the weird stuff that happened here. So first of all, if this is empty, that doesn't seem great, right? It's empty. So what validity property do we see before that checks whether or not there's even a value there? What validity property did we take a look at before that checks whether or not a value is even there? We all think. Yeah, right. So we had value missing. Value missing was our way of checking whether or not a value is even there. And it was triggered because we had the required attribute. So we can actually even improve this code further. So let me first go ahead. I'm going to say password.validity.value missing. Let's refresh this. When I hit create account, it says the value is not missing right now, but the value is missing, right? So what do we need to add to our HTML to change this? What do we need to add to our HTML to get value missing to work? Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Azari. So we're going to add required to this. If this is required, then value missing, when we hit create account, this comes back as true. I know this looks like everything's fine, but down here we're getting that changed value of true. Okay, so now we can improve this code by not just checking whether it's too short or too long. We could also check, is there a password at all? How would I do that? How could I add this statement, this check, to this conditional? What do I need to do? Or what might this look like? What do you all think? I want to update my code, so I'm not just checking whether it's too short or too long. I'm checking as well that it exists in the first place. What do y'all think? See some folks type in, folks are thinking, wondering. Yeah, Joseph, I think that would work just fine. Let's give it a shot. So what Joseph's suggesting is we'll add to our conditional here. So if the validity, if it's too long, if it's too short, or the value is missing, go ahead and run this code. Let's check that out. Oh, not bad. All right, so now we're using validity to check for a few different conditions. If this message isn't that helpful, because the password is too short and that it doesn't exist, but maybe we want to explicitly state, hey, you didn't do anything, right? In this case, we could just add another conditional to this. We could say, if it's not even there, then do one thing. Otherwise, if it's too long or too short, do something else. You just totally cheat and copy this over. Text content could be something like, we need to enter a password. And then all the rest of this remains true. Omar's on it. Perfect, right? It's not too bad. So we're seeing here with validity, there's a lot of different ways that we can start to customize the interactions that users have. Pretty powerful. Okay, just a random thought. This code looks pretty similar to this code, which looks pretty similar to this code. I think we could probably put this in a function if we really wanted to. Just throwing it out there. Just throwing it out there as an idea that might be applicable in 15 minutes or so when you start your lab. Just throwing it out there. But you can do whatever you want. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Seems like there's some duplicate code here. Kind of interesting. All right, so for too short and too long, we can trigger those attributes to be toggled as long as we have min length and max length. That'll then return true or false according to whether or not the inputted value is too long or too short. And then in this case, too long and too short is not going to evaluate whether or not a value exists. In order to do that, we would need to use value missing, which will require a required attribute attached to the input as well. So again, this is a little tricky because we're having to, the HTML is informing our JavaScript, which we're then depending on. Right, so both those things have to work together. This is kind of what I meant earlier about like, the JavaScript's kind of like hijacking the HTML form validation. It's plugged into it, so we can't separate them at the moment. Great. Let's take a look at, we have two here? Yeah, we have two, oh man, I do that consistently. We have two knowledge checks here. So first one here, this is a snotty question. If we have a number input with a min length of 10, we type the number 23. what would too short return? Yeah, excellent. All folks saying false. This is a bit of a tricky question. The correct answer here is B, as too short and too long apply to text value inputs, not number inputs here. So it would just stay as false. All right, we just talked about this a number of times. The value missing property applies to inputs with which attribute? The value missing property applies to inputs with which attribute? Yeah, excellent, y'all. Right, so value missing is related to whether or not an input has the required property. All right. Cool. All right, so those are the common validity properties that we might use. So we have valid, right, which is just checking whether it meets the overall constraints. We can check more precisely for like value missing, type mismatch, too short, too long. Those can be used to then it'll toggle the truthness or falseness of those different properties within the validity object. And just a reminder to recontextualize here, the HTML validations are good. They already provide some of these checks on their own. But if we wanted to plug in some JavaScript into our page so that we can do things like change the color, provide maybe a more specific warning message, we can plug in to the those HTML attributes and do something a little bit different, right? We can actually run validations on our own, sort of hijacking how the HTML validations work. So that's what we're talking about. Again, it's the purpose of this. All right, just a few more things to discuss, and then we'll take a break and move over to our lab. So there are also a few methods that are attached to the validity object. Hey, someone help remind me, what is the difference between a function and a method? Talked about this, I believe, last week, not before. What's the difference between a function and a method? When I'm saying a method, how does that differ from a function? Or what's the relationship, I should say, between those things? What do you all think the difference or the relationship between functions and methods? Had some people typing and we scared them away. What do y'all think? All right, Omar says, I might be wrong. Method is tied to an object. Omar, you are wrong in that you might be wrong, because that is a good answer. Method is tied to an object. So when we call a function from an object, it's often going to look like dot that function name and in parentheses afterwards. That's a method. So we've learned a lot of methods, right? We've learned pop, push, We've learned object.values, object.keys. And now we're going to learn a couple more methods of check validity, report validity, and set custom validity. I'll add as well, I think this is like, these are the kinds of questions we can always look up to. So like, what is the difference between effect and effect? That's probably good. Between a function and the that's not bad. A set of instructions that are associated with an object, specifically associated with an object, right? It's going to always tell us a bit more. So I actually like where you're going here. So it just says, I guess a function has an output, but a method called to perform some action or built-in functions to perform some work. I think actually the distinction there that I like is a function can do like literally anything, right? A method could also do literally anything, but often it is related to that object, right? It's related to the thing that we're calling it from. So there is a little bit of like a purpose-driven difference as well between those things. It doesn't have to be in JavaScript. You can really do whatever you want. But ideally, right, the methods we're going to call off of an object are related to the functionality of that object, or maybe even to the inner workings of that object. So I think you're on the right track there too. All right, excellent. Perhaps it feels like I'm bugging you all with these terminology things, but this is the kind of stuff I think if you like go on an interview and you're able to use these terms correctly, it's actually it's a positive signal that you all know what you're talking about. So hopefully not being too annoying here to get this language down. All right, so before we get to the lab, we're going to cover 3 methods. The constraint validation API provides. This constraint validation API is what we've been working with the validity object. We have check validity, report validity, and set custom validity. All right, so check validity and report validity are very similar, except check validity is solely programmatic, whereas report validity actually does interact with the DOM. So this is a little odd, but it's definitely kind of interesting. Let me actually read through this first, and then we'll see the example. So both methods will check if a form or form element is currently valid. All right, so it's going to check for validity. If they are valid, the methods will return true. So that means calling these, invoking these methods will return true if whatever they're getting called on are valid. Otherwise, we'll get false. If report validity returns false, it will trigger the browser's native validation message for the first invalid input. And this is the slightly weird bit that's a little bit different between them. So let's take a look at this. So our validate form is going to get called when we submit this form. We're doing some checks here. Fantastic. This looks very similar to what we've done before. We're going to run the check validity function. And actually, down here we have report validity. I'm going to comment that out for right now, just so we can see check validity. What this is going to do is going to check the overall validity of this form. If it is valid, it's going to go ahead and submit, change some colors, and then eventually go ahead and reset the overall form. We take a look over here at the inputs. We can see here for the username, the requirements are that it is required. It needs a min length of at least 8 and a max length of 20. And the email is just required. There's no other details there. So I could just write email here. Let's get something that is 8 characters. Hit submit. Oh, it's doing the email check from the type. All right, fantastic. I'll do it correctly here. Excellent. We saw that it's submitted just fine there. So I just need a long enough username, a valid email, and it seems good, and then it'll go ahead and submit. So check validity is just checking that the overall form is valid. That is versus if I set an email here, it's going to please correct the errors in the form. Now, this on its own When we submit, we'll start to trigger whatever the first problem is. I believe just because we're submitting the form. Let me just show you a different, let me show you just form report validity here. I'm just going to put this down here and let's see what happens. Oh, because I didn't define that. Hello. Okay, let me stop messing that over here. All right, I'm just moving some stuff around. Okay. Before we've submitted anything, we go ahead and grab the form, and then we say report validity. So notice when we refresh the page, it immediately says, please fill out this form. So the report validity function is checking for whether or not the form is valid. And if it's invalid, it's going to go ahead and push those errors to the forefront. It's going to show those errors for the user. If I replace this with check validity and I refresh, notice nothing is happening when the page loads. This function is still getting called, excuse me, this method is still getting called. It is still likely returning false. We can go ahead and check that by logging this out. Yes, this form is indeed invalid, but report validity will go ahead and enforce this to show up. I'll go ahead and force this little error to show up. So that is the only difference between these two things. Either way, this is just going to check, hey, is the form overall valid? If so, move on. If not, go ahead and, in this case, cause this error to show up. It's triggering the HTML validations. So that's the difference between these two values, check validity and report validity. And they will return essentially the same thing, but report validity will report the validity. Really, it'll report any invalid, the first invalid input to the user. Yeah, so I'm going to ask a great question. So instead of validating each property of the validity, wouldn't it be better to just use check validity? I think it depends on what you want to do and what the kind of feedback is you want to give to users. So here's what I would say, like in terms of like the steps you're going to follow in terms of developing a form. First, you could just add the HTML constraints, right? So doing the type, required, things like that. That's going to work for a lot of situations. In terms of what you want to do next, then, if that's sufficient, great. What you might want to do is you might want to do things like highlighting the border of the input red, or changing some, having an overall list of errors that shows up at the very end. There might be something more stylistic you want to do that you can't necessarily do with just the HTML forms. For something like that, I agree. I think actually check validity or report validity, however you want to sort of do it, I think those would be a good next step to follow, is like, great, we're going to rely on the HTML validations to hopefully help folks as they're typing it out. But then let's just check the validity at the very end, and then maybe run through and do some checks, or just say like, hey, the form's incomplete, right? That'll give you enough information to stop the form from being submitted. But what check validity does not do is provide any specificity, or like, it doesn't allow you to pinpoint any part of the form to check whether or not this part of the form is invalid. Because notice the message we're getting back, we just get back false, and it just triggers the first error here. So it's not telling us, hey, your username is too short, or you forgot your password, or your password confirmation doesn't overlap, right? So for that kind of specificity, that's where you want to get into more custom validations. And at that point, it kind of just depends on how much information you feel like you need to give to the user. It could be something like you're just checking whether or not there are values in each field, and maybe that's enough. But for like a particularly long form where there's 13, 14 fields, you want to really be able to highlight, hey, you did everything correct except this one, and actually send the user back to that spot. So I think for shorter forms, something like check validity could actually be totally fine. For longer forms, though, it may actually be worthwhile for the user to be a bit more specific and provide them more useful feedback than just, hey, the form's wrong, which could be frustrating as a user trying to figure out. Does that make sense? Does that feel persuasive as well? It doesn't feel like I'm just, blowing smoke. Yeah, so I do think like it really kind of depends on the situation here. I do think a good order of operations is do the HTML stuff, maybe do some check validity at the very end. And then at the point where your form starts to grow, that's where you might be like, I really need to tell people that I want a password that has one special character, one uppercase character, one number. Like that's the kind of stuff where you want to be more precise for users. Great question, though. All right, I'm going to move on from check validity and report validity. Very, very similar. Report validity is just going to force a message to show up. Now let's look at the fun one. So set custom validity is a method that accepts a string as a parameter. This string that gets passed in will overwrite what the error is going to be. So we can see in this example, the error message will only appear if the form input element is actually invalid. Without creating our own custom error handling, we are relying on the built-in error display. So as opposed to, you saw in some of the previous examples, there was like red text at the bottom down here. We could add a little error field. That's one way to do it. But if we want to actually leverage the existing display, we can use set custom validity. So we have a lot of very silly messages added in here. So we can see that set custom validity is called a number of times within this. So let's go ahead and see how this works. So I'm gonna go ahead and submit here. And notice our error message no longer says like missing value or something kind of generic. We can actually specify what it is. We can be a bit more prescriptive. Right, and so that is coming from here. So when I submit, it's taking this message and plugging that in. If it's too short, so if I type in a message that's too short, it'll add a new message within here. And in the case where the value is not missing and doesn't meet any of these other things, right, it'll just clear it out. It'll then move on to the next error message, right? And this is attached to this particular input. So calling set custom validity, notice we're calling it on specific fields in here, and calling this is going to trigger that message to show up as long as there's a value passed in here. And so when the error message shows up, it'll show up with whatever text we put in here. So this is a way to actually sort of jump into how the HTML is validating things. And so we can add our own messages here, which is pretty neat. At least I think so. Once everything's correct, then it'll go ahead and go to this block of code down here. So again, set custom validity will allow us to custom set some of the messages that are in here. And pause here. Any questions on this? So we've just gone over a number of different ways to perform validations on inputs. So remember, we talked about HTML validations, just pure HTML. We then talked about the validity property, that object that is attached to different inputs and forms that will have different key value pairs depending on the constraints we've added within the HTML itself. We also talked about a couple of different methods like check validity, report validity, which will check for overall validness, and set custom validity that will allow you to set the error messages that show up within the style of that HTML validation. And I think like Omar asked, And I think like maybe some of y'all may be wondering, it's like we're giving a lot of tools here. What is the right answer of what to use? Well, here's what I would say. Of course, there isn't one. It kind of all just depends on what you're trying to do. I think the order I discussed earlier, I'm starting with HTML first, and then you adding check validity, report validity, and then adding some more custom things really works. I think for most websites, though, honestly, what you'll find is a lot of custom validation that's built with JavaScript. I think that's actually what you're going to find when you go out and are playing around the web and looking at real applications. As you all saw, there are some limitations to some of the HTML validations. Some of like the email checks are a little loose, some of the URL checks are a little loose. Those are the kind of things that it makes sense to be a bit more prescriptive about and write your own custom validation. And I think this is a bit of my perspective here, but I think what I've seen is that folks tend to not mix and match these too much. So either they'll rely on HTML validation in terms of the little these kind of alerts showing up, or they'll be doing all custom validation. In my experience, it's pretty rare to see them mixed up, where you'll see this and you'll see errors at the bottom and you'll see colors changing. It tends to be folks kind of like choose one over the other. With that said, I think building into the existing framework we have is pretty smart, and it's certainly going to be easier for developing initial websites. Validation can take a lot of time, and it's really about protecting your data and your users from doing the wrong thing. So I think this is a great thing to be learning, and it's really powerful overall. So that's been my mileage with it. It kind of all depends. And again, there's not really a right answer here. It kind of just depends on how much work you want to do and what you want to leverage in your web applications. With that, I think it's time for us to hit over to a break. We're just about 40 after, so we come back around 50 after. When we come back, we will go ahead and start talking about this lab that we'll do. We will be building some validations into this credit card payment form. So go ahead and take that break. Just we'll answer your question when we get back, and see you all in a few minutes. Lots of hair. All right, hope y'all had a nice break. Omar, no, he's not gonna do the lab for us, unfortunately. He's focused on two things, maybe. One of which is food, one of which is going outside. You have to wait, bud. Sorry. All right, let's discuss this lab. So this lab, I think it's pretty good. It's going to give you all a bit of a challenge here on trying out a lot of different skills we've talked about over the past few lessons. Let me share my screen here. All right. So let me talk through it, and then we'll give you all most of the time to do it. I will post out a solution in the, where'd that go? I guess I'll put it in live chat. At the very end, so you'll have a reference point. But I think I would love for you all to give this a shot, mostly on your own, as opposed to me talking through it. We've just talked through all different examples. So I do think you have enough examples there. All right, so now that we're more familiar with form validation, let's add some validation to this example payment for. There are multiple approaches you can take. Here's what is required. So for this form, which has information for like a billing address, a credit card number, all inputs should be required and have some validation added. On submit, if the input is invalid, the label text should be red for that specific credit card. On submit, if the input is valid, the label text should be green. So again, that's for the specific input field. You should have at least 3 inputs with custom validation messages. That's what we just saw, right? The state input should only allow 2 letters. So that is this one that is, if you were in America, we have our abbreviations of like California, Washington. The zip code input should only allow 5 numbers, so up to a maximum length of 5. the card number input should only allow between 15 and 16 numbers. And the CPV should only allow for 3 numbers. So that is, those are the requirements of what you can do here. Again, everything should have some sort of validation to it. We're going to add some custom validations to this. And we're going to add a bit of style as well by changing these labels to green if it's good and red if there's an error with it. There are a couple tips down here of what you could do to check for specific values. There is some solution code here, but I'll send out my own, which I think might work a little bit better forward. Any questions on what the ask is here? All right, who's excited? Some jazz? Yeah, custom validations. You all can add silly messages. You can choose whatever green and reds you want, add additional validations. It's up to you. So no worries. Let yourself be creative if you would like. All right, we will I'll stop talking there, pass over to you all. Let's give folks, we'll say 25 minutes or so. That'll bring us to just about the end of class. If you get done, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. Otherwise, once we come back together, I'll see if there are any lingering questions that we can discuss. Otherwise, we'll close out for the day. I think that's it. And if you have any questions, you all in live chat, and good luck with this lab before we come back together. We check in, it's 20 minutes after. How's it going? Questions that are coming up? Any issues? What do y'all think? It's going swimmingly? Is it just tears? Only sobbing? What's the feeling? Omar, we're gonna have to ban you from adding that. It's too consistent. All right. If there's any problems, what's going on? What's the trouble? Yeah, there's definitely it's verbose, the amount of code needed, right? There's a lot of, you gotta select a thing, you gotta do some checks, you gotta figure out all the different keys you need. Yeah, Joseph, perfect. If you're going back to reference some of the examples we did, that's awesome. That's exactly what I would expect y'all to be doing. Yeah, all good. Okay, all right. So it sounds like folks are plugging away on it. Any lingering questions from today's lesson before we split for today? Tomorrow reminder is the review of a project and introduction of a new project. Okay, all right. All right, well, so what I will do is I will share a solution in live chat. I'm going to schedule send it for a few hours from now, just so you all can really have some time to work on this individually. We'll have access to it as well on the guide, but I think there's a couple of minor issues in that, so I'll send out another version of it. Please do, even if it's taking time, it's worthwhile to work through this. This is a good culmination of a lot of what we worked on. You have to add event listeners, you have to manipulate the DOM and access different elements, change some styles. It's a really good project to be working on and spend a little bit of time on. And if you can do this, if you can get to the end of it, that's a good signal to me that this information is starting to stick and that you have a good grasp of it. If you have any questions, we will have probably some time tomorrow to discuss as well. So if anything comes up, we can of course discuss then too. I think that's it then. Any lingering notes, C1 folks?